Hi, my name is Will, and I'll be talking about our work today on strategies for reuse and sharing among data scientists and software teams. This work is alongside my co-authors, April, Rob, and Steve, when April and I were working in Rob and Steve's group at Microsoft Research. So in recent years, we've seen the collection and analysis of data proliferating in a variety of industries. For instance, in healthcare, people use data to model patient outcomes, in technology, using data to understand user behavior, and in finance, to model consumer behavior. In each of these industries, people are using data to try to understand their own processes better and to make better decisions. As this data industry has grown, so have the number of people doing this work and the nature of their jobs. So whereas a typical technology team might have just involved a software engineer, now they're often working alongside data scientists and a variety of other roles, including data engineers, business analysts, or data analysts, each of which has a slightly specialized role and are interacting with data in a different way. As previous people have written, there's no such thing as a unicorn data scientist that can do each of these jobs. This specialization helps because each of these roles has different demands and knowledge associated with it. But part of the goal of our work today is to understand how coding practices actually differ between these roles, in particular, how practices from software engineering have evolved and been adapted for data science. So if we look at data science for a minute, what this involves is a highly iterative exploratory practice to understand data. The tool of choice here has become computational notebooks, and one is shown in the bottom right. And these involve cells where you can write code and see the output immediately below. These are very conducive to data science since they can iterate quickly. However, computational notebooks have some issues. They can be messy and non-reproducible. They might lead to bad coding practices because of unexpected execution orders and a lack of modular code. And their users tend to think less about the future use of their code. And all of these issues compound to make the process of reusing past analyses different than traditional software reuse in software engineering. And reuse in standard software engineering is really the standard. Modular reusable code has been a staple of effective software engineering for decades at this point, and there's a variety of rich online repositories to help facilitate this reuse and sharing, such as NPM for JavaScript, PyPy for Python, or Crayon for R. Part of the reason for this is that prior research has shown that proper reuse leads to fewer bugs and higher developer productivity, and principles like don't repeat yourself have really become baked into the ethos of software engineering. So our research question today is really, how does this exploratory practice of data science fit with the fundamental task of finding, reusing, and sharing past analysis work? We're interested in when do data scientists actually reuse their code and how do they find this past analysis code? How do they adapt and reuse their own analyses and those of others for their current task? And then how do they share these analyses between other data scientists? And in particular, we want to see how these needs might inform future tooling needs. So I'll start out by talking about our methods for answering this question. We began with an interview study where we talked to 17 different participants that were all data scientists or equivalent job titles at Microsoft. These were each 1-hour interviews where we asked these participants to describe their experience with reusing past analysis work. And from this, we generated themes on reuse and sharing. We followed this up with a survey with 132 respondents from the same pool of data scientists. This was a 10 to 15 minute survey. And our goal with this survey was really to assess the prevalence of these strategies and themes with a larger pool. A little bit more about who we interviewed. So in both of these studies, our participants came from a wide variety of teams, backgrounds, and experience. They had experience ranging from only 3 months doing professional data science to over 35 years. And their education also had a wide variety. People with undergraduate degrees or PhDs, they came from technical backgrounds or humanities backgrounds. This really underpins how there's no common training on how to best do data science. People bring their training to the table and answer questions about data in whatever way. However, all of our participants expressed an admiration for people writing what they viewed as production level code on software teams. These people are all working on small teams, on average from 1 to 22 people. They're either working in a centralized data science team that fields requests from a variety of different areas and asking them to inspect different things from different data sources, or they're working on a particular product or software team. But something interesting here is that on most projects, data scientists are working alone or in pairs to do analysis. So this is distinct from a typical software engineering project that might have dozens of people all working on the same code base. To actually generate themes, we used open coding to generate 97 different themes. Then two of the authors worked to apply these codes to the transcripts. And we turned these into three primary areas of themes. So the first are some comments on the practice of data science and data science workflows. Next, we identified 5 strategies for use and sharing that we'll explore. And lastly, some influencers on why people share and reuse analysis code. So I'll start out with our findings on data science workflows. So there's really 2 key findings here. The first is that the outcome of data science is not the actual code. So this is unique because the code that people are writing to produce analysis is not actually what's delivered. It's the insights from this analysis or the reports. And I'll explore the implications that this has on reuse in a second. The next is that data storage influences the tool that can be used to actually access that data, which in turn influences people's sharing and reuse practices. Not all tools support reuse at the same level, and so people have to adapt their tools and their practices to what they can do with that particular tool and data storage. So first, the outcome of data science is not analysis code. Instead, people are delivering slide decks or reports or models that are then handed off to people to scale up into production. And so the code that people are writing to actually produce these artifacts, in particular slide decks and reports, is not often viewed in the same way as code and software engineering. So for instance, it's not always worth the investment to make this code reusable if they're not sure if it was just a one-off analysis or if they'll be using this code again and again. And so this has some implications for how willing people are to actually invest this time to make their code reusable. And we'll explore this in some of our themes later on. This is distinct from software engineering, where the deliverable to a certain extent is the code that people are writing for the product. Next, we'll talk a little bit about how the tools that people are using shape sharing and reuse. So what I'm showing here are the 8 most commonly used tools among our interviewees. And so these range from scripting languages like Python to Cosmos, which is a SQL, NoSQL type query language, notebook-based tools like Databricks, Jupyter, and VS Code, and a variety of other tools. But the takeaway here is that there's a wide variety of tools and languages that are used for analysis, and that they have to be adapted to be reusable based on the affordances of that platform. Regardless of what they're using, data scientists want to be able to reuse their past analyses in their analysis code. However, not all of these tools support reuse as easily. And we'll explore some different strategies for how people actually make their tools able to reuse past analysis code. So that's what we'll dive into next, our 5 strategies for reuse and sharing. Before I go through these, a little bit about what functionality is actually reused. So this didn't actually vary much across strategies, regardless of how people are using their code. They're reusing code for similar types of tasks. So from most to least common, the most common type of code that people are using is code for data preprocessing, transformation, and cleaning. So this code is often linked to a particular data source. And so then whenever I pull data from the source, I want to clean it in the same way so I can use it for whatever task I'm doing. Next is code for reading and writing from data sources. That way I don't have to remember weird database names or API keys. I can just reuse this code. Next is code for modeling and evaluation, followed by code for data visualization and reporting, and then a variety of other tasks like model ensembling, selection, and post-processing. So people reuse code with 5 unique strategies, and we have organized these from those that we view as taking the least effort to the most effort. So the first 2 just involve reusing my own code at a personal level, and the next are reusing code among an actual team. So I'll step through each of these in turn. The first is personal analysis reuse. So what this involves is finding my own past work and reusing it. As one of our participants said, anything I know I did before, I reuse it. Notably, this code isn't actually cleaned before storage. So whenever I do an analysis, I just save it somewhere on my local machine or maybe on a Git repository that I use so I can use it across multiple machines. This could be computational, notebooks, or scripts, but I'm not actually investing time to clean it up. I'm just keeping it so that if I want to reuse it in the future, I have it. This is easy and quick because it doesn't involve me having to clean the code at all, but this can lead to issues like no formal versioning, so I might have analysis v1, analysis v2, that are all using very similar pieces of code. However, I can't actually do versioning across these. So our next form of this is a personal utility library. As one of our participants said, these files are just calls which I've been using for 3 or 5 years now. I just constantly go to them again and again and again. So I extracted these very, very generic common things to a single repo called utils where each file does a single thing. So what they're talking about here are short snippets of code that are often reused, so it's worth the time investment to refactor these into a reusable function. This is distinct from our first form of reuse, personal analysis reuse, because it requires intentional cleaning of this past analysis code to put it into a reusable function that might be imported like a traditional library or just copy and pasted out of this personal utility library. Our next form of reuse is among a team, and this is team shared analysis code. This is often a central repository for sharing code among a team. This might be on GitHub, where the code is organized by the person that wrote it or by the data store, or more ad hoc forms, such as sending an analysis notebook over messaging or email. This is sharing both computational notebooks and scripts for analysis, but the code here is almost always cleaned before sharing. And so the reason that people are doing this is that it helps avoid repeated work. When there's no infrastructure for doing this sort of sharing, it leads to a lot of frustration. As one of our participants said, tons of work was repeated in many places, because if you weren't a part of the team that had access to some shared drive somewhere, then you didn't know that that work existed. So when they worked on a previous team that didn't have the sort of infrastructure for sharing among their team members, they found this really frustrating because they felt like they were repeating analyses and writing code that had probably already been written before. Of course, sharing in this form requires a time investment to actually clean up the code before it's shared with the team. So this leads to a tension between actually using shared code and contributing new code, where people are using shared code far more often than contributing new code. Because you have to answer this question of, as one participant said, when is my work good enough to share with other people? If someone hasn't explicitly asked for your analysis and you're putting it on the shared repository, you have to make sure that this is something that you think someone in the future might use. Another similar form of sharing among a team are what we've called team shared template notebooks. So these are cleaned, generalized notebooks for a task that have been shared to a centralized store. So one form of this are just template notebooks with to-dos at the top. That might be for a particular task like data cleaning or producing a model. And so I copy this notebook and it has some to-dos where I fill in my new data source or something else, and I can reuse this in a notebook form. Another form of this is using notebooks as functions or libraries. So what this might look like is that I have a notebook on my left that's a new analysis, and I call the notebook on my right. For instance, this is the syntax for Databricks where I say dvutils.run, and I can pass in some arguments to the notebook on the right. So I'm just calling this notebook on the right like it's a normal Python function. This is an example of data scientists adapting their experiment-based tool, the computational notebook, to support more traditional function calls and reuse. And this reuse can happen on the platform where the work is done, in particular in the notebook. However, not all tools easily support this form of reuse. So for instance, we saw less than 40% of our survey respondents actually adopting this, just because not all tools support this form of calling notebooks as functions, for instance. This is really popular because it meets people where they work. And in particular, it helps people easily tweak existing code. So for instance, as one of our participants said, they use template notebooks when the code requires customization when applied to different scenarios. And in data scientists, most analysis code requires this level of customization. Of course, the drawback here is that it can be hard to maintain updates across so many notebook forks and tweaks. So our last form of reuse is the traditional software library. So this is for code that does not change much, such as data access APIs. As one of our participants said, the library that we have is for interacting with our catalogs and our file systems. This notebook that they were showing me right here is mostly just time series analytics. This could have probably been added to library, but it's something that we add to every day. Whereas when we change something for the file system interaction stuff once a month, we add it when we add a new data set or something. So what they're talking about here is that they use the library for stuff that doesn't change very much, in particular the data access APIs, but when they're doing stuff like template notebooks, they want to be able to add to that every single day. Of course, there's the traditional benefits of reusing common code, like less repeated code and easier updates. However, some people still prefer the easy customization and debugging afforded by template notebooks. So this leads us to a key takeaway here is that the nature of data science work does not always lend itself to traditional libraries for analysis code. And next, we'll talk a little bit about why, in terms of what are the influences on reuse and sharing among data science. So the first is time. So time is the reason that data scientists do and do not reuse code. So when they want to reuse, they do this because it offers time savings. However, too much time investment prevents them from reusing when it takes too much time to actually adapt code for reuse. And so we see that it's more likely that data scientists are willing to reuse a past analysis or someone else's past analysis when it takes very little time for them to actually adapt it to their current task. So for instance, this might be cleaner, well-documented code, or code that requires a smaller number of edits required to adapt it, or code that would be very difficult for them to write on their own. And all of these are qualities that mean that they will save time by actually reconfiguring this old code rather than writing it from scratch. Similarly, team culture must incentivize this time investment. So we asked participants 4 different questions. We said, it takes a time investment to take code ready to share. My teammates use the things that I share. They feel that my team values me spending time to make code shareable, and I'm rewarded for doing so. And I have the time to do this work to make code shareable. And we see near unanimous agreement that sharing code takes a time investment in the top 2 responses, and that people are using it when it's shared. However, there's less agreement there's actually support for making this time investment. As one of our participants said, sharing code in data science is often not rewarded at the level needed to offset the investment necessary to do it well. This really points to a core tension among sharing and reuse in data science. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications of this work for future tool use. So the first is something that we've talked about several times, but is that the deliverable of data science is not the code. So in particular, a tighter coupling between presentation environments, such as slide decks and reports, and coding environments might support easier data iteration and analysis iteration. So what this means is that I can more easily find old code that either produced a chart or a statistic in a presentation and go back to that code. And this is particularly difficult because it's not just linking a PowerPoint on my left and a notebook on my right, but it's linking the code and that data so that I can do follow-up analysis. Next, customization is absolutely essential for reuse. In data science, the code can rarely be reused out of the box and it needs to be tweaked. So for instance, if I have a model training template on my left that has 3 steps, 1, 2, and 3, when I use this in 3 different analyses, I'm probably going to only use the first 2 steps in my first analysis. Maybe I'll use the first and the third step and then add a new one in my second analysis, and then add a new step in between the first and third step in my third analysis. And so this is really important that data scientists are able to customize the workflows if they want to reuse past analyses. And this is part of the reason why template notebooks and notebook reuse is so powerful, because it supports this customization. Lastly, the lack of tool interoperability limits reuse. So for instance, if I have some of my code written in Python, my teammate has an analysis written in SQL, and someone else on our team has analysis written in R, how do I actually borrow parts of their code for my own analysis? And this leads to a fundamental tension when people are writing data science code in different languages, different environments, but I want to be able to reuse it. There's been some headway along this front with data standardization efforts like Apache Arrow, but I think that more work on the tooling side can continue to make headway on this so that people can reuse analysis code regardless of where or how they're writing their analysis. So this has been strategies for reuse and sharing among data scientists and software teams. Thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in the full paper or more, you can either scan the QR code on the right or follow that link, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.